On that particular night, the only sounds in our old house were Lily's rhythmic snores on the baby monitor. Other than that, all was silent. We heavily relied on that little gadget to keep an eye on our precious daughter while we tried to get some sleep. The hectic routine of new parenthood had finally become familiar to my wife, Sarah, and me. Our adorable little cabin perched high in the mountains always seemed like the ideal getaway from the commotion of city life. The peace of the nearby forest was disturbed, though, on that particular night, by an eerie creaking sound that we heard through the monitor. The sound started out softly, like an old wooden floor creaking under some unseen weight, but it quickly became louder and more enduring. When I abruptly woke up, my heart was beating fast. We sat staring at the baby monitor as if it held the solutions to the ominous sounds, with Sarah already awake and her eyes wide with fear. The monitor continued to echo the creaking, which caused the hair on my arms to stand on end. Sarah said in a low voice to me, "Did you hear that?" My throat was feeling dry as I nodded. It looked like it was the floor upstairs, the room where our daughter slept. We heard other sounds in addition to the floorboards creaking. There was a cacophony of sounds, and then there was a murmur, like whispered voices, and this was all through the monitor. But in the house itself, we heard nothing. Despite the fact that there were only the two of us in the house, it seemed like someone was saying something through the monitor, something we didn't understand. As we stared at one another, we exchanged glances. As parents, we were aware that we needed to look into it. Louder voices were heard. We rushed upstairs and entered Lily's room. As we forced the door open, what we noticed was perturbing. The infant was dozing off, oblivious to the eerie noise. The voices changed from hushed whispers to clear voices, though still unintelligible. Strange, frightful, and unsettling. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, but the strange thing was that we didn't hear the sounds in the room itself. It was all coming from the monitor. We shuffled toward Lily's bed, keeping our eyes on her the entire time. There was nobody else in the room despite our best efforts to look in the closet and under the bed. "We need to leave right away," I said to Sarah as my heart was pounding in my chest. We got up and left the room as the voices got louder. We drew ragged, shallow breaths and ducked into the hallway's protection. Even though the baby monitor was on the floor, the strange voices continued to crackle from it, and it was still unclear where they were coming from. I shut off the baby monitor. There was an agonizing silence after the voices stopped. We stared at each other, mirroring the fear in the other's eyes. "Let's go downstairs," Sarah said. The horrifying noises kept playing in our ears as we descended the stairs. Even though the voices had stopped, we made the decision to spend the rest of the evening in the living room with Lily. As the evening dragged on, frustration started to set in. We worked up the courage to go into Lily's room as the first rays of morning light peeked through the curtains. She was still nodding off, and it didn't seem that the strange things that had happened that evening had bothered her. Looking for any hints or indications of what had transpired, we combed the space. There were no longer any strange noises or creaking, and neither were there any open windows or unlocked doors. Everything appeared to be operating normally. It was easy to write off what had happened the previous night as the product of our exhausted, overworked imaginations when it was daylight. but the anxiety we felt was all too real. We set up our belongings as if we were never going to come back. I couldn't help but feel that we had encountered something that was beyond our comprehension, something that defied logic and explanation as we left that disturbing alpine retreat. The baby monitor used to be our lifeline, but now it was a doorway to the strange and unknown. We still don't know what happened on that fateful night, so all we can do is make assumptions based on what we experienced. We were left with the unnerving knowledge that, occasionally, mysteries defying logic and reason lay just beyond our comprehension, waiting to be discovered in the hidden corners of our home, which went from being a serene mountain retreat to a dreadfully sinister place. Story 2: Backyard Mystery. I'll never forget that night, the night I thought I was living in a real-life horror flick. It all started when I woke up to the sound of children crying in my backyard. Now, you might think that's a normal thing, but trust me, it ain't. It was pitch black outside, and the nearest neighbor's house was miles away. I couldn't figure out why kids would be crying in my yard at this hour. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer as I stumbled out of bed. I grabbed the knife I kept under my bed just in case, and crept to the window. The moonlight was just enough to make out a couple of shadowy figures huddled by the old oak tree at the edge of my property. My mind was racing, thinking maybe some lost kids had wandered into the woods, scared and crying. I had to help them, right? I mean, who wouldn't? So I threw on my coat and slipped on my boots, then carefully opened the back door. As I stepped out into the chilly night, the cries grew louder, sending shivers down my spine. It was like they were in pain, desperate. I moved closer to the tree, squinting in the darkness. That's when I saw them, the children. I saw them from a distance, but I could hear them. I couldn't see them clearly, but their cries were so real, so heart-wrenching. "Hey there, kiddos," I said, trying to sound as friendly as possible. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response, just more crying. It was unsettling, to say the least. I took a few cautious steps closer, my grip on the knife tightening. "Come on, it's gonna be all right," I shouted, my voice trembling. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The kids were eerily still, almost like statues. I mean, real kids don't just freeze like that when a stranger approaches, right? And when I got closer to the kids, it hit me like a bucket of ice water over my head. These weren't real kids. They were decoys. My blood ran cold, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I'd seen enough horror movies to know where this was going, and it sure as hell wasn't gonna end well. I took a step back, my heart racing. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from behind me. I spun around, and there he was, standing in the shadows of my own house, a tall figure cloaked in darkness. Panic surged through my veins as I gripped the knife, ready to defend myself. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted, trying to sound tougher than I felt. The figure didn't answer. He just took a step closer, his eyes gleaming in the dim moonlight. I could see his grin now, a twisted, malicious grin that sent chills down my spine. This guy wasn't here to ask for directions or borrow a cup of sugar. He was here for something much worse. I knew I had to act fast because he was still far away from me. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I told her everything. The crying children, the sinister intruder, the whole nightmare. The intruder must have realized I was on the phone with the cops because he started to run at me with surprising speed. I swung the knife with all the strength I could muster, and I hit him. I hit him good. He let out a howl of pain and stumbled back. I didn't waste a second. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me and barricading it with the heavy oak dresser. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, my heart pounding as I heard the sirens approaching in the distance. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, the police arrived, and they didn't waste any time. They stormed my backyard, guns drawn, and found the intruder lying there, groaning in pain. Turns out, the guy had an extensive rap sheet, and he'd been using those creepy decoy kids to lure unsuspecting victims into a trap. I couldn't believe it. I had almost become another victim, another name on the evening news. The police hauled him away, and I finally let out a sigh of relief. It was over, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I couldn't sleep for weeks without hearing those ghostly cries in my dreams, without feeling the cold presence of that intruder lurking in the shadows. Story 3: Noises from Below. I was thrilled to hear that my parents were leaving for a week of vacation and leaving me in charge of our home. I had a whole week of freedom, but little did I know that it would turn out to be a nightmare. It was a great first few days. I enjoyed myself immensely because I had the entire house to myself. I listened to loud music, had fast food for dinner, and stayed up late watching scary movies. Before the terror night descended, life was peaceful. When I first noticed these strange noises, it was about midnight. I initially dismissed it, assuming that the wind was just playing a trick on me. However, those noises grew more ominous and louder as the minutes went by. My sanity was being clawed at by something that seemed to be scratching the basement walls. I made an effort to stop my heart from racing by telling myself that it was just my overactive imagination brought on by the horror movie I'd been watching earlier. But as the night went on, it was impossible to ignore. I felt goosebumps with every scratch on the basement walls. Eventually, I succumbed to curiosity and fear. I had to look into it. I made my way carefully down squeaky wooden stairs while trying to control my breathing. Only a weak light was coming through the small windows in the dark basement. The scratching noises persisted and resounded in the stillness. I moved a little bit closer to the source of the noise, my breath caught in my throat. When I turned on the light, all that could be seen for a brief moment was a flicker of doubt. I then noticed him. An eerie figure with his back to me was slouched in the corner. My blood was racing with fear. I managed to stammer, barely audible above a whisper, "Who the hell are you?" No response was given. As if he hadn't heard me, the man just kept scratching the wall. Though I was shaking, I was determined to find out what the intruder in my basement was up to. I scoured the area with my eyes, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. I grabbed an old baseball bat that was leaning against the wall. I moved closer with my makeshift weapon in hand as my heart raced in my chest. I rephrased my query. I said, "Who are you?" a little more vehemently this time. I first noticed the intruder when it slowly turned to face me. His face looked like someone had taken a knife and played connect the dots on it, because it was covered in twisted scars. His wild eyes gave off a kind of madness that made me shiver to the core. He suddenly lunged at me, and my instincts took control. I gave it everything I had and swung the bat, hitting his shoulder. He stumbled backwards while yelling in a guttural tone, clutching his hurt arm. With adrenaline rushing through my veins, I ran up the basement stairs. As I slammed the basement door shut and shook my hands over the lock, my heart was pounding in my ears. However, the nightmare continued. His screaming could be heard, resonating throughout the house as he pounded on the door. Panic set in as soon as I realized that my phone was upstairs and that I couldn't call for assistance. I was stranded in front of my basement, alone with a psychopath on the other side. I had to get out of the house. My only choice was the back door since it was closest. I rushed through the house, feeling my heart race until I reached the back door. As I struggled with the lock, I could hear the basement door splintering from the intruder's relentless assault. The back door swung open, and I sprinted out into the chilly night air. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I ran across the backyard to the neighbor's home. I cried out and knocked on their door, pleading for help. Thank goodness they sheltered me, dialed 911, and the police arrived within minutes. The invader's rage was unchecked, and he was still confined to the basement. When he was apprehended, it turned out that he was a crazy drug addict who had lived in our house for who knows how long. For my own sanity, we stopped discussing that evening after my parents hastily returned home. But I couldn't get rid of the image of the manic's face from the basement, and the persistent memories of my encounter wouldn't stop bothering me. Now, whenever I'm at home alone, I can't help but wonder what might be lurking in the shadows. The terrifying events of that night continue to haunt me, serving as a reminder that the line dividing safety and danger can frequently be razor thin, and that, on occasions, survival may require all of your courage